My first talk today is one that I've a little bit more prepared for. The second one, you'll probably notice if I stumble. That was when I'm going to step up for Dave. But the first talk is a year in review, and I don't know how many people really even want to remember last year, given how stressful of a season it was. I'm guessing most of the superintendents in the room lost a few years on their life because of all the challenges that we were faced with. And this is, I've done this talk, I've tweaked it a fair amount specifically for this audience to include more golf course facets that the golfers, I think, would pay more attention to. So some of the superintendents may have seen some of these already, but this is my favorite image that I've taken with the green section so far in the first three seasons. This is Gardner's Bay, out on the east end of Long Island. And believe it or not, the members there were thrilled with this image. They don't have any fairway irrigation, so this is firm and fast at its finest. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. But this is just shocking to me to see what things could happen if you didn't have irrigation on your golf courses. So thankfully, I know many didn't have anything this severe, although it was certainly a season full of challenges. And we think of the weather that we experienced this past season. For most of us, I would guess it's probably the most stressful season weather-wise that we've experienced maintaining golf courses. Playing in the heat and humidity was certainly a challenge as well. I pinpointed July weather, and I chose Paramus. Just I don't know, I must have been looking at that recently when I did this graph, so I just randomly chose Paramus. But the weather holds pretty true for the island as well. If you think about general turf decline occurs when the temperatures are right around 80. We certainly manage our turf grasses pretty well under these conditions, but when it gets upwards of, you can see that second week of July was, it was 100 degrees or so. I remember it hit over 100 on the east end of Long Island, which is very rare. And then as you move west, it obviously gets a little bit warmer. So really, really stressful conditions throughout the entire season. And just taking a snapshot of July, which was the worst month, but June was pretty tough, and August was pretty tough. It's not surprised that our turf didn't agree with us. We got sort of a Washington, D.C. type of summer, and our grasses were not used to that, and they paid the price. So here's the average temperatures, 91 through July, when we typically expect to see mid to high 80s at the most, and nighttime temperatures were really high as well, and that's usually the most damaging. So stressful summer, it just highlights our weaknesses on our golf course with our irrigation systems or what we can do with respect to hand watering, microclimates if we've got greens with shade or airflow issues, if our root zones maybe have too much organic matter or don't drain well, and then finally just what we do to the surfaces themselves with frequent mowing and rolling. All these things are a stress that usually the turf can handle under normal conditions or moderate weather, but under extremes sometimes we see the issues. So irrigation coverage, this was pretty common, unfortunately. If you've had poor irrigation, an old system, heads that maybe were a little bit off kilter, it didn't take long for the problems to show up this year because it was so hot and dry. And I saw a lot of this on tees where, it's a tee, it's a very important part of the game of golf, but everyone's focus was on the greens, and rightfully so. So when this happened, it really wasn't a surprise in a lot of places. Fairways certainly is a little bit more extreme. You're talking, 20 to 30 acres of turf. And the way I describe that to non-superintendents is picture 20 to 30 football fields. That's the type of acreage that we're talking about. That's the size of turf that we're trying to keep moist and not let get to this scenario. And this happened actually relatively quickly, the damage here, where an irrigation head just stopped coming on. 2 or 3 days of it not coming on under the intense heat of July, and pay the price. Then you compound that, it's a golf course. We've got to get out there and play. We've got to use it, but under the wrong conditions, car traffic can be really damaging. I'm sure you guys are well aware of the damages that can occur to grasses when they're saturated and they're exposed to car traffic, but the same holds true under drought stress or heat stress. It can be pretty lethal, and this image illustrates that. And then with respect just in general to irrigation, our pumping capacity, a lot of courses had shortages with their own water supplies, with their storage ponds. And this was the course at Yale. Scott Ramsey pointed this out to me. You can see the irrigation pond here is significantly lower. For those of you guys watching the flat screens, let's see if I can do this. Here's the irrigation pond. Obviously, you can see it's much, much lower than normal. And it's never a good thing, and this was his quote, it's never a good thing when Google Earth can pick up your problems in your golf course. He was forced under water restrictions, A, because he didn't have a recharge, and 2, because of some political decisions that were made against his opinion. And, they just had to shut things down and really limit it, and they paid the price. Stressful years, we're going to see problems with a lack of water, but in a lot of cases we'll see problems with too much water. And I've had this discussion at a lot of golf courses. You've got irrigation hitting your putting greens and then also throwing under the approaches. And a lot of times they're part circles where they don't spin all the way around. And so what happens in a lot of these scenarios is they basically turn to water the green, stop at the approach, and then the same thing for the approach. It stops in the same spot. And when you get two heads that stop right next to each other, that's adding twice the amount of water that you want there. And under tough conditions, hot and wet scenario, it doesn't work too well if you're not on the ball. So unfortunately, this happened. But all in all, dry year, we'll take it. It's much easier to manage turf under hot and dry conditions than hot and wet conditions. So another example of water issues here, black layer is something that is not really a new thing, but it's usually a result of too much water at the surface or maybe a drainage problem if there's black layer at the bottom. But that's just an indication that there's no oxygen in the profile. And this case was resulting from too much water. Especially in a dry year, that's a bad sign. So irrigation management, what can we do? And there's a ton of things, and I won't get into this too much. The generic recommendation, hand water and syringe as much as your budget or resources allow. I a lot of times get laughed at when I say that one, but it's just the most uniform. Your soils don't dry uniformly, so that's where adding in supplemental hand watering to the high areas that typically dry out quicker, doing an afternoon syringe to cool the turf is really helpful. Next, with respect to your automatic overhead irrigation systems, you really need to focus on uniformity and coverage. We saw a lot of minor deficiencies in irrigation systems crop up this year because of the dependencies that we had on it. So if you've got an older system, and I'm guessing many in the audience do, you need to start thinking about planning for the future with replacing or upgrading that system to maximize your coverage and uniformity. Wetting agents may be needed. These actually improve the root zone wettability. So these have been helpful for some as well. And then some other issues to offset any salts that may have cropped up if you had poor irrigation water. Maybe subtle adjustments that may be needed to make. But the big thing that I think is thinking about drought contingency planning. I mean, we had 2 different stretches on Long Island where we had really long periods without significant rainfall. New England probably had it a little more severe. Jersey had some issues as well. But you've got to plan for reduced water availability in the future. And the way I think about it, if you have a plan in place and the right people know, your green committee, your course officials are on board with it, it's going to be a little bit easier to make these decisions as to where you're going to reduce your water usage when you do get stuck in these types of scenarios. Those that did get the rain, really didn't want it in most cases. I know July was dry. The average for, I think, this area was somewhere around 2.5, 3 inches. But a lot of it came in 2 heavy shots of water, and that's not what we really want. The heavy thunderstorms saturate our turf, and then it's tough to dry out. And here's a prime example of what can happen. I think I sometimes get accused of being overly critical when I look at putting green profiles, as they're not perfect. You need to do more. You need to modify them more. But this is what I'm preparing for when I look at a profile. The worst case scenario, hot and wet conditions. If you don't drain in the top few inches, it can really get ugly. That's what happened to this green. Heavy rainstorm, no drainage, not much they could do. And it's not just native soil greens, sand-based greens. We're subject to these same types of problems. These are all this year. This green drained great, but it had a 2-inch thatch layer on top. So that thatch really held that moisture pretty tightly and didn't let go, and hot and wet, and didn't work out. So again, saturated thatch layers, it's really damaging. It basically heats up when it's under when it's saturated, and really damaging to roots, and it's just a bad scenario, not to mention the poor playability that too much organic matter thatch has. So really the best case scenario is to do your due diligence, put in the work with modifying your root zones or making sure that they're going to perform to a decent level. You've got to be invasive. You have to do something to the surface to make a dent in the profiles, whether it be through core aeration, aggressive verticutting, and then combining that with frequent top dressing. All these things go hand in hand. Without doing these, your profiles probably aren't going to perform too well, and that's going to translate into problems at some point. Growing environment issues, not surprisingly, we see poor growing environments hurt every year, even when it's not as stressful, and this year was magnified a great deal. So the basics, we think of shade, just have lower plant energy because it's not photosynthesizing enough to compete with the respiration. We have poor plant development, shallower roots, weaker turf. A lot of times if it's morning sun that's being blocked, it stays wetter for longer. You probably notice it with your frost delays this time of year and as you move into the fall. But the bigger factor there is diseases and mechanical injury are through the roof the longer the leaf stays wet. So you've got to take trees out, do what's right for the turf. And then from an airflow standpoint, this was pretty severe as well this year. It was just so hot and muggy that grasses just did not tolerate those conditions if they didn't have ample airflow. So again, same thing. I realize trees are a valuable asset to the property and part of the game of golf in the States, but not when they're causing these types of issues. You just need to adjust these microenvironments if you don't have adequate airflow. Using fans is a great way to do it, but the older the fan, the less beneficial it's going to be. If your fan has a high and a low switch, that's probably a sign to update the fan. I don't know when to use the low and when to use the high, but you got to go something big. I realize they're sometimes an eyesore, but they're really, really effective. The bottom line with these fans, though, they've got to be put in the right place. Sometimes that means directly in the line of sight from hitting your approach shot. But to maximize their benefits, that's where they've got to be. They've got to be close to the surface. But they really do work. We saw some other interesting things. Desperate times call for desperate measures. That's entirely accurate. It was really helpful. This scenario, actually took this photo a few years ago, but really pocketed green, and it wasn't really the trees. It was more that it was just sunk into the landscape. So these fans actually helped out a lot. They still had some other issues, but this is my favorite here. They parked a tractor next to the green and had the blower on the back that usually used to blow leaves or clippings, stuff like that, and it really worked out. Part of the image that I didn't capture was the probably $1 to $2 million home that was about 30 yards away. So they made some new friends too, but it helped. Again, desperate times. This is what folks did this past year to survive. And I mean, you can see there's no airflow getting through this side. So what are you going to do? You've got to do something. Turf is dying. You can't always just let it die. Disease standpoints, I just wanted to briefly touch on this. Some of this will be a little bit boring for the course officials, but summer patch is a really devastating disease that takes out primarily Poa annua on our greens. And it was the most significant disease that I saw this year. So I just wanted to touch on a few things. It's a stress-related disease. Under high temperatures and drought, it typically is more damaging. So there's some cultural practices we could do with respect to our fertility regimes that can help minimize it. It doesn't prevent it from happening. So if we knock the pH down in our root zones, that's usually helpful. We start targeting this pathogen sort of mid-May, early May, when your soil temperatures get to right around 65 degrees. And that's really the best time frame. There's a lot of materials to apply for it, and something that I found that was kind of interesting. The latest information that Dr. Clark gave me from Rutgers is with DMIs and strobilurin fungicides, you can use 2 gallons of water and not water them in, which I think is probably helpful for a lot of people that are going after different funguses at the same times. But when it comes to preventative or curative applications with 3336 is probably what most would choose, that does need to be watered in. But you need to choose these things wisely. The DMI fungicides all have growth regulating side effects to them, so that they can cause some some unwanted effects. Anthracnose is probably a disease that many of the course officials have heard about. This has been probably the biggest disease problem that we've had in the Northeast over the past 10 to 15 years or so, and we're getting a lot better at managing it because of the research that's been done from the Northeast region. But things can get pushed too far, especially when there's other stresses like shade or too aggressive mowing or rolling. But generally speaking, anthracnose wasn't too severe this year. I wanted to briefly touch on this because I know some people have a lot of questions about this newer material. It's called Civitas. It's not exactly a fungicide. It's got some plant health benefits, I guess. It works kind of weird. But the bottom line is that it stains the turf kind of a weird green color, but it does have some fungicidal effects. So it's got some benefits. But there are also some negatives that we really don't know a whole lot about the product yet. So if you use it repeatedly, you have to be really careful with it. In the summer when the plant is under stress, maybe it's not the best material. I've seen a couple examples of where it seemed like the Civitas was hurting the turf. But for the course officials out there, well, why would you apply this then if it's been some negatives? It's inexpensive, very, very environmentally friendly, and it's got a lot of promise for certain courses that are under really tight pesticide budgets or pesticide restrictions. So we're still learning a lot about the material, but I want to just show you some of the potential downsides to it so far. But again, it's still got a lot of potential out there. We just need to learn how to use it best in our programs. So, but again, the damage from it can be kind of ugly. Annual bluegrass weevils, let's move into insects. This is another major issue that we have to battle in the Northeast here. This insect continues to boggle the minds of all the researchers that are working on it. It's kind of surprising that the more they investigate, the more questions that they have. So it's really frustrating. But what this insect does is it pretty much selectively feeds on annual bluegrass if you've got annual bluegrass on your fairways. It has shown to damage creeping bentgrass, but not nearly as much. And it's frustrating because it's really hard to track these things. We've got inconsistent control with different insecticides, and the answer just isn't to spray more. That's actually the worst case scenario because we've got resistance concerns with some of these materials. So it's damaging. The one thing I would suggest is to continue to do as much monitoring as you can with soap flushes and the linear pitfall traps. That's really the best course of action to figure out what the weevil's up to, when it's moving, and when it's not. Weed pressure was through the roof this year. This is probably one that a lot of golfers noticed. When you're looking at bunker banks and things like that, it was pretty bad. I saw a ton of yellow nutsedge, kalinga, false green kalinga. These things all look pretty much identical unless you get down to the seedling. And one of the main reasons why I think it was, well, number one, it's more likely to be a problem under stressful conditions, hot conditions. But number two, like I said earlier, we were really focused on our greens this year. This kind of stuff, it certainly caught our attention, I think, but at the end of the day, we need to go and make sure your green is still alive, or you control some weeds that are in the bunkers. So the bottom line with this, though, is that we can usually easily control these things. A couple different herbicides out there, but these were usually a problem, and where I saw them, it was most of the time because the focus was just on the greens or on the fairways to make sure things were still alive in the areas that were really important. Bunker banks were lit up this year as well. These things they're always tough to maintain. North-facing versus south-facing slope is probably something you've heard your superintendent talk about. When we think of the other issues with bunkers, we're constantly hitting sand out of them over years and years, and the classic I like to do on visits is put my soil probe in these bunker banks, and you just show that this thing is a foot higher than what it used to be because of all the sand that's been splashed out of it. That makes it really challenging to maintain uniform turf on these bunker banks and make sure that their moisture is where it needs to be. And to illustrate the north versus south-facing slope, I risked the lives of a bunch of folks driving behind me, but I took this probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I knew it was a perfect image. And snow on the north-facing slope where it's shaded doesn't get as direct sunlight versus the south-facing slope that's just has no snow on it. And this is a huge scale of what your bunkers are forced with. forced to deal with. So it's really stressful. Getting irrigation coverage to hit bunker banks uniformly is next to impossible. So that's a challenge too. And all these reasons, I think, is why some of these bunker banks got hurt this year. And the same thing, focus was on the areas that really mattered on the greens and on some of the other surfaces. Okay, sort of kind of getting close to wrapping up here. The biggest issue I saw on putting greens this year was a combination of all the heat stress and drought stress, but also what we do to it on a daily basis. Just mowing and rolling in general is a stress. Even if we backed off, I mean, the turf was under so much stress this year that it just couldn't take a lot of the abuse. I think a lot of folks, if they had that week back, right around the 4th of July, they would have backed off then, and maybe that would have helped out a lot. But we can't do that. All we can do is sort of learn from it. But the point here, and this is, it's easy for me to preach this. It's harder for you guys to, you guys are having to live it every day. But losing a foot or more on the green on the stent meter, for healthy turf makes a huge difference, I think, in the long run. You've got to take obviously the arrows from upset members or golfers, but it's well worth it as opposed to this scenario. In the Northeast, Poa annua is king, or annual bluegrass, and it's just not tolerant of the types of stresses that we put it under when it comes to our summer stress. So we've done a great job at managing it, but maybe it's time to start thinking about, this isn't the strongest species out there. There's been a number of courses that have gone the regrassing route. Most of them have done this because they've had turf problems, but one course in particular has decided to regrass just to take their greens to the next level. And that's encouraging, I think, to me, because there's so many courses out there that lose the regrassing battle because they've got decent or good conditions most of the time. But with new bank grasses that are out there, you can have really, really good conditions most of the time as opposed to just decent or good. So it's certainly an option to regrass. You've got to do a lot of tree work, make sure the root zones are in the right state to be able to have success with this, but it's definitely an option for most people in here if you're willing to do some of the side things. But bentgrass isn't bulletproof either. Everything can be pushed too far. This actually was a tough scenario for the superintendent. Had their biggest event in mid-July and was really under the gun and had some great conditions for the event, but things went south after that. So bentgrass can easily be pushed too far. So just sort of wrapping up a few things. What did we learn? I think from a superintendent standpoint and from a course official standpoint, communication with our golfers, with our committees. This is always going to be really important, especially when it's a tough year. Irrigation is always super important, but this year we had a razor-thin margin for error, and we probably saw our weaknesses show up if we had some. Putting the turf needs in front of trees, so making sure there's enough airflow and sunlight on our greens is always important. Moderate growing environments this year just got hammered. Normal year, maybe they're okay. You lose a little bit of grass, but it's just thinning. This year, if it was a subpar growing environment, it probably took it on the chin pretty hard. So you got to take trees down. It's just part of growing grass. Controlling thrashing and fashion improving drainage on putting greens is always going to be important just from a playability standpoint. I'll touch later on firm and fast conditions, and if you don't have number 4 taken care of, it's going to be pretty much impossible to try to produce firm and fast conditions. But this is also helpful when it comes to those hot and wet conditions that we're prone to having. Avoiding ultra-low mowing heights or malnourished turf. This was kind of the anthracnose thing. Most in the room that I'm familiar with are not doing these types of programs. We've come a long way from what we were doing maybe the past 5 or 10 years. I think a lot of people have actually stayed even with their mowing heights or maybe raised it up a touch and learned that we can get good green speed with rolling and top dressing and other things. It's not just shaving the turf down. Adjusting our surface management programs when we are in stressful weather. No one had a crystal ball last summer to be able to predict that we just would not get a break from the weather. But if we did, I think we'd all agree that, boy, we would have backed off a little bit earlier. So I would encourage you to try to do this as much as you can. Adjust your service management programs when you start to see that, hey, this is late June and we got a lot of the summer left and things aren't looking as good as we want them to. What a lot of folks did, they reduced their mowing frequency, increased rolling, reduced any sort of grooming or took off their grooved front roller, that kind of stuff. And the green speed usually suffered a little bit, but in most cases, it was well worth making these adjustments. Controlling traffic as much as possible. This is, I sort of forgot this was on there. I took this slide out. Stick with proven effective materials. This is always important in a tough year. There's new materials out there that offer a lot of promise, but you've got to do your homework with them and not just sort of test them on your entire golf course and then use them when you know you've had success with them in the past. Communication, this is for the superintendents. Communicating with your peers. I saw so many of you guys this year that just looked worn down, and you weren't happy to find out that other superintendents were having problems, but you were happy to know that you weren't the only one that was in a fight for your life kind of scenario. So keeping those communication lines is always helpful. And then when in doubt, if you've got concerns, it's probably not a good idea to pull the trigger on some more delicate agronomic practices. Improving airflow, sunlight, backing off on the turf is always going to pay off. But other practices, you probably could end up hurting yourself a little bit more than that. So tough summer, lead into a tough winter. I know, talked to a lot of guys just earlier, and it sounds like snow mold's been a pretty significant issue on the island. That's the least of a lot of golf courses' concerns when they're staring at some pretty severe winter damage. It's been spotty where there has been some winter damage, but it was a tough winter. And most point to the heavy snowfall and a quick freeze-thaw event in early January as to where the problems kind of started. So this is never a fun way to start spring, and some golf courses are pretty severely impacted by it. So I just want to quickly touch on rapid recovery and best things to do if this is experienced on your golf course. Don't play the damaged areas. That goes without saying. I know it's not going to be a popular decision for your golfers, but temporary greens are going to get things back that much quicker. Open these areas up and do some overseeding. There's a lot of combinations that folks can use with respect to slit seeding, core aeration, verticutting, two directions. There's a lot of ways to do it. But I wouldn't wait and try to get a cover system out there. That's going to help warm the soils and improve germination. If you're forced to sod, it's kind of a delicate issue, especially when you get really cold temperatures. Bentgrass doesn't warm up too quickly. But pick a date and stick with it, and make sure you keep things close until everything's recovered. Be gentle on these areas when you're getting recovery. Use hand mowers, solid front roller. Start at a pretty high mowing height. Be conservative there. Treat these things like they're a new green, basically, with your grow-in program in those areas. That's going to help out a tremendous amount. And then irrigate as late and frequently as you can to promote germination and recovery. And things could be far worse. It's kind of a bittersweet photo. I don't know if anyone has seen this. This is actually a green in Japan. So obviously they're dealing with some things that are a little bit more severe, but a little bit of problems on our greens are nothing in comparison. So this was pretty amazing. I just want to quickly touch up on some of the latest and greatest with the green section with respect to our technology, and hopefully everyone gets the green section record via email. If not, I know we have a sheet downstairs that you can sign up and you can get the free weekly updates. But we've really focused a lot on communicating more and communicating better, specifically with the green section. So if you don't get that subscription, please sign up. It's a good resource. And that's something else that's just Dave wanted me to mention is that with each visit, this is for superintendents, we offer now continuing education credits, which has been something that superintendents have been harping on us about for years because it's an education opportunity. So we wanted to touch on that. So with that, I appreciate everyone's attention.